Okay, Don.
Well, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Troy Stangarone, with whom I had the pleasure of working for 5.5 years at the Korea Economic Institute of America. And Troy his official title is Senior Director and Fellow, but the title doesn't mean that much. He's an expert on trade. I had been involved in international trade as a member of Congress for 20 years. And I really began to learn it when I left and had the opportunity to have my office right next to Troy's. So Troy's going to talk to us today about trade and trade sanctions. And Troy, perhaps you could start off with giving just a very brief introduction as to the Korea Economic Institute of America, because you and Mark Tokala from that organization and my former organization are going to be featured in this series. Go ahead.
Well, Congressman Azul, thank you for that very kind introduction. Dr. Lee, thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to speak to the class, and I hope we have a really good discussion. As Congressman Azul mentioned, I work for the Korea Economic Institute in Washington, D.C. We are a small policy shop. There's just 9 of us. We have between 3 to 4 interns, depending upon the time of the year. And we really focus on the U.S.-Korea relationship. And so that includes the economic relationship, that includes the alliance, that includes North Korea. Congressman Zul mentioned sanctions. It includes dealing with sanctions on North Korea. So we really kind of focus on that wide gambit of issues. When we do this through our own research, we do this through events that we put on, going out to speak to people at universities or at World Affairs Councils around the country, or events in our own office, and podcasts and other multimedia things as well. So we really try to focus on all of those kinds of things. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about trade and how it plays into foreign policy, and what types of tools the U.S. has. I won't necessarily maybe get into everything, but I hope to touch on a lot of the major types of tools that we have, both in terms of advancing trade, be it either part of an economic agenda or a foreign policy agenda, but also as part of our broader tool in terms of sanctions and also foreign policy. So with that, I guess before I start, Congressman Zul, is there anything else that you or Dr. Lee needs to say to the class?
No, we're all set. Logistically, I'm at our place between Gettysburg and Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. Ron, you are in class at Rockford University with some of our students, and at times we have students zooming in from Mongolia and
Cairo.
And Cairo. So it's a small. Rockford University is a small school, but we have, I believe, it's 118 foreign students from 18 different countries. So we're very proud of the departments that get involved in international policy.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to everyone today, and glad to hear that there's people from all around the world potentially watching right now. So what I'd like to do is, just sort of to start off, I've got some slides, and I will take and sort of go in and out of these, but what I'd like to touch on is, first off, give a brief discussion of, what is the role of trade and sanctions in U.S. foreign policy? What types of trade tools do we have? And in this sense, I mean on the expansion of trade or foreign policy side, what trade enforcement tools do we have? How do we go about doing sanctions on different countries? What are some of the challenges that are going on right now for U.S. trade policy in general? And then I'd like to end with some future challenges for U.S. trade policy. And so what I'd really like to do is, there's this quote here from Cordell Hull that I want to start off with. And I think this sort of encapsulates the way the United States, to a large extent, has viewed trade since most of the post-World War II period. Former Secretary of State Hull said, and this is from his memoir, I saw that you could not separate the idea of commerce from the idea of war and peace. You could not have serious war anywhere in the world and expect commerce to go on as before. and I saw that wars were often caused by economic rivalry. And I thereupon came to believe that if we could increase commercial exchanges among nations over lowered trade and tariff barriers and remove international obstacles to trade, we could go a long way towards eliminating war itself. And this is in the aftermath of France and Germany having fought over Alsace-Lorraine and Europe being plunged into war twice. Really this idea that if we are sharing resources, if we are sharing commerce, it creates incentives to maintain peace, to build ties, and to take and really sort of advance, broader agendas for economic growth and stability. And so when we think about the role of trade in foreign policy, there are a series of things that, it can do. One, as I've mentioned, we can take and work towards creating, broader peace and stability. We can take and, in the specific instance of, the end of World War II, trade policy was used to help Europe and Japan rebuild. We saw this in the Marshall Plan, so also, economic assistance, but also opening up US markets to goods from Europe and Japan to help them restart their economies. It can be done to strengthen the domestic economy. We often hear about how, Americans are a very small percentage of the world's global consumers. So whether you are a farmer in Illinois or you're a manufacturer in Illinois or another part of the country, this creates new markets for you to be able to export your goods and then to take and help grow the US economy. At the same time, one of the classic views of trade and its relation to foreign policy dealt with alliances. The idea being that military power, which is often viewed as sort of the standard for how states, one, measure their role in the international system in terms of the power they're able to project, but also their ability to actually follow through in the case of war, that if you had allies with strong economic ties, that would help boost the economies of those allies and therefore take and make your military allies also more productive if war were to come about. So it was about strengthening those ties between the economies and between the allies. So that way, in the event of war, you had the best military resources possible. But in more modern times, we've often also worked to try and build stronger ties with our allies just in general. And so you see this with some of the modern FTAs that the United States has done. At the Korea Economic Institute, I've worked a lot on South Korea. And one of the goals with that FTA was really to try and not just open up new economic markets for the United States and address, barriers that American producers had faced in South Korea, but to try and increase ties of business, to increase ties of cooperation, to increase people-to-people ties, to really build strength within the alliance and make it a deeper ally than the one that we had before the FTA. The FTA, or US foreign policy and trade, can also be used to support economic development and humanitarian objectives. So, we see this with a lot of US home assistance or general preference programs, where we're hoping to try and instill, deeper economic growth, try to address poverty issues in other countries, help them along the path of, building more sustainable, so hopefully democratic societies. And these are ways that we can try to use trade in foreign policy and where these two areas sort of interconnect and cross. With that, there is also the role that sanctions play in foreign policy. And when we look at that, apologies, what you see is that sanctions also play an important role in US foreign policy. When we face a challenge in the international system, be it the North Korean nuclear crisis, be it racial issues like apartheid in South Africa, other issues that need to be addressed where international norms or other things are being violated, oftentimes a military response is not the preferred response or the proportional response. So sanctions allow the United States and the international community through the UN Security Council as well to provide a proportional response to international concerns or threats to international peace and stability. They are useful where military force, as I mentioned, is either impractical or undesirable. Where you have a case where norms are being violated, be they in South Africa, be they in the situation where Russia invaded the Ukraine, they allow you a tool to take and address that without engaging in military conflict. In the case of North Korea, we have tried to utilize sanctions to, one, bring them back into compliance to rejoin the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but also to coerce them into talks to address this issue. Sanctions also play a useful role in deterring other states. Right now, if you look at the situation of North Korea, most of its primary export commodities are banned. Many goods that are needed for industrial production, but that also have a role in the development of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, are banned from being exported to North Korea, both on the US side, but more internationally through UN sanctions. And so the idea is that hopefully other states will be deterred from trying to take similar actions by realizing the types of economic costs that they would face if they were to pursue nuclear weapons or in different situations to violate certain international norms. But it's also to take and signal the resolve of the international community and to signal to domestic constituencies that, the US government does take these issues seriously, that we are trying to take action, and that we are taking steps to try and address the issue. So sanctions play an important role in UN foreign policy, specifically where perhaps diplomacy isn't quite ripe, but also military force would not be practical or desirable. So what types of tools do we have for trade agreements or to expand international trade? Call this the more positive side of the foreign policy agenda. We can engage in bilateral investment treaties. We can engage in free trade agreements similar to what we have done with South Korea. There is the multilateral system through what is now the WTO, where you can also engage in plurilateral trade agreements. And there's also the trade preferences and development assistance programs that the United States has put together over time to try and help developing countries. So when we look at these options, what we see is that the United States on bilateral investment treaties has over 50 BITs around the world. These are largely designed to protect US investments in foreign markets, to help develop market-oriented policies, and to promote US exports. And it does this through, for example, ensuring that US investors are treated the same way as local investors are in foreign markets, or that they receive the same type of treatment that other third-party investors receive as well, that their IP is protected, and that they're allowed to take and remove their profits at market exchange rates. So all of these things are built into these investment treaties to try and take and help facilitate trade between the United States and other countries, and also to take and develop these economic ties, while at the same time trying to take and help countries really move more towards market-oriented policies. There's also a sort of lesser level of this, trade and investment framework agreements, where the United States with third parties takes and sets up basically working groups to address important trade issues between the two countries and try and help facilitate understanding and perhaps changes where necessary. But those are not on the treaty side. So free trade agreements. The United States currently has 20 free trade agreements. These agreements cover roughly 35% of our trade. The other 65% is largely covered under the WTO's rules. So we only do a small relative portion of our trade under our FTAs, but they've played an important role both from an economic standpoint and a foreign policy standpoint. Our first FTA back in 1984 was with Israel. It had two purposes. One, to take and demonstrate support for Israel within the Middle East, but two, also to take and demonstrate that a bilateral FTA could be a tool for taking and advancing international trade liberalization. Now, over time, we did, for example, the Jordan FTA, which was also to take and try and help facilitate economic ties and peace between Jordan and Israel. So we've used them in various sort of explicit foreign policy objectives in certain times. And as I mentioned, we've tried to take, and with the South Korea FTA, to build deeper ties with South Korea. But other FTAs, such as CAFTA, were also designed to try and promote economic growth, within developing countries, to try and take and address broader issues within society, address issues with immigration by creating growth so that way people find opportunities at home. And so they can have a lot of these different types of objectives and uses. What makes US FTAs unique? They are high standard agreements. Many countries' FTAs do not include the types of coverages that a US FTA covers. Some countries' FTAs sometimes only cover up to 20% of trade. Technically under the WTO, it's supposed to cover substantially all trade. So many other countries' FTAs oftentimes don't actually meet the standard. US FTAs do. They cover goods trade, they cover services trade, they cover investment, intellectual property, government procurement, and also labor and environmental standards. And in this case, what we often do with labor and environmental standards is we require countries to sign up to different international labor and environmental treaties. So that way we know that they are functioning by sort of core labor and environmental standards that will take and help to promote fair competition with producers in the United States. So that way they aren't undercut by, for example, being able to dump, toxic waste somewhere rather than having to deal with it. So trying to take and create more of an equal playing field as well. Beyond FTAs, as I mentioned, there is the international level where you have multilateral or bilateral agreements. This started off with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. There were multiple rounds, which eventually took and evolved into the World Trade Organization. Most countries now, today, are members of the World Trade Organization, though when the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade first began, that was not the case. It was mostly sort of the core Western countries that we know today. But the last attempt at a round was the Doha round, and that round did not succeed. It largely fell apart over concerns of developing countries over agriculture. But what new rounds allow us to do is it allow us to take and address tariffs and to create more avenues for international trade. But in addition to addressing tariffs, and I'll talk about this more later, it's important also to update the rules for international trade. And one of the challenges the United States has faced has been with its trade with China, and how China, for example, doesn't necessarily protect IP well, and it takes and has in many cases taken and forced the transfer of IP from US companies to Chinese companies. And so while there are all of these concerns with China, what we found in a recent WTO dispute settlement case is that, as USTR Lighthizer said, the WTO right now and its rules aren't really set up well to deal with a state that engages in these types of intellectual property actions and also subsidizes its producers. And so, on a multilateral level, this is why, a future round would be important to update trade to deal with these types of issues. But also, we live in a much different world today. The Doha round was during the Bush administration, shortly after September 11th. And while that was clearly a seminal point for US history, it also signifies, if you think about it, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, many of the social media tools that people use today did not exist then. E-commerce has taken off while it existed before to a much greater extent. And so many of these types of issues and how you deal with digital trade, what's coming in terms of digitized currency, all of these things are going to need to be addressed in future rounds. And if they're not addressed in future rounds, that means you're going to end up with a world to where you will have either regional or national rules. Sometimes they will be in harmony, sometimes they will conflict, but that will make trade more difficult. But it will also make it more challenging for managing disputes when they arise. The other thing that is often done at the WTO level is what's called plurilateral agreements. These allow like-minded countries to take and reach an agreement on things, for example, like trade and environmental goods. There's one dealing with information technology. And so many countries, have zero tariffs on information technology goods because of a prior plurilateral agreement to where they were agreed to liberalize these goods, even though in the WTO in general, that wasn't the case. And so this really kind of allows you space within the WTO where there are sort of issues like this that are perhaps key issues to address those issues without necessarily getting everyone involved, but to create standards that others can join as they progress both in the development and in their own trade liberalization process. So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of, a trade agenda in terms of expanding trade or foreign policy are the use of trade preferences in development assistance. We have what's called the General System of Preferences. It's a non-reciprocal duty-free access option for developing countries. There's roughly some 3,500 different tariff lines that this can apply to for these countries. But there are standards. They do need to meet eligibility in areas such as intellectual property and workers' rights. And the Trump administration, less than a year ago, removed, for example, Thailand from the general system preferences because it wasn't meeting the labor rights standards that it needed to do. So these are things that can change. There are certain requirements, but the general idea is to take and provide an avenue for these countries who are developing, who might not be able to, at their point of development, to really fully open up to the United States or other developed countries for competitive reasons and other issues, to have access to the US and continue to grow their markets. But we do have certain expectations of certain standards being met for these countries. There's also what's called trade capacity building. This is essentially funding and training and technical assistance for developing countries to help them better integrate into international trade. And this helps in terms of, for example, training port workers so that way you can move goods in and out of a country more efficiently, reduces costs, it makes it easier for producers to get their goods in and out of the country. But it also works when you deal with, sanctions. So for example, North Korea tries to look for areas that or countries where there are weak customs systems. And so if we are able to take and better train customs workers, build better capacity in these countries, it will make it easier for them to be able to identify and to know what types of things countries like North Korea, who are trying to smuggle goods illicitly under international sanctions, are doing, so that way we can better enforce international sanctions as well. So there is an economic side to this, there is a foreign policy side to it on the sanctions side, and trade capacity really plays or can play an important role in handling these types of issues. You also have development assistance. We often think of, for example, USAID, but there are other agencies and other avenues to provide this. But I mean, this can range from a wide range of things, such as, funding for education. We've seen this, for example, in the rebuilding in Afghanistan, money for economic development projects, be they, new roads or other types of things, things to take and try and help governments to advance their own democracy. So we can utilize a tool that, while not necessarily trade specific, but that does take and help countries to help them develop better systems, help them develop better rules and norms, and that ultimately has states that are able to better take and develop their own systems to better take and match up with international standards, makes commerce and foreign policy easier for the United States because you now have more partners who are able to take and meet the same types of standards as the United States and other countries. So it's an important tool for taking and being able to move things forward. Now, these aren't the only tools that we have. We also have tools that relate to our ability to take and engage in enforcement of our rules. And this is an important part of the process. I've recently been working on a project to deal with North Korea sanctions. And one of the things that I point out is that sanctions are only effective if they are, as a tool for negotiation, if they are enforced well. And we often see times that sanctions are not necessarily enforced well. And, that is one of the challenges that we face. But in terms of our own trade enforcement rules, we have first the international option, which is the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. You have our own anti-dumping and countervailing duties procedures. And then through various legislation passed by Congress, you have Section 201 procedures, Section 232 procedures, Section 301 procedures, and Section 311. And what I'll go through and I'll do is I'll talk about all of these. And one of the things I'd like to note, and this applies not just to the trade tools I just mentioned in terms of expanding trade, but also to our sanctions and our enforcement policies, is it's important to keep in mind that, under our Constitution, the power of commerce is given to Congress, not the executive. So while we have taken over time, delegated many of these authorities to the executive, ultimately they are congressional powers. And so when you look at something, say, for example, like Section 311, which deals with terrorist financing and money laundering, it was done under the USA Patriot Act after September 11th. These are new powers that were taken and given by Congress to the administration to deal with these types of issues. And so when I get a little further into specific sanctions discussion, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that at the end of the day, many of these sanctions that we have are often sort of bespoke. On North Korea, there have been different acts passed by Congress which have applied specific sanctions that only apply to North Korea. And they are things that the administration is required to do. One thing that I think is often missed when we talk about sanctions on Iran, for example, many of the oil sanctions that the Obama administration utilized and the Trump administration is trying to now utilize were passed by Congress. And at the time they were passed, they were not actually tools that the administration at the time wanted. And so, Congress has an important role to play in foreign policy, and they play it oftentimes through economic policy, be it either through sanctions policy, expanding, the ability of the administration to take and engage in different types of trade agreements, or through taking and then approving of those agreements, for example, in the case of FTAs. And so when we, think about this, it's important to keep in mind that, because we have two levels to address things, you often have to determine what is the best forum for addressing your dispute. And so one of those forums is on the international level, the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. What this does is for violations of international trade rules under the WTO, there is a process for initial consultations between the parties involved. If they are unable to work out their differences, a dispute panel can be formed. And then both sides will present their case to the panel. It will, based on international trade laws, set a verdict. That verdict can then be appealed to the appellate body. But once that is done, what essentially happens is that countries will then either have the right to place retaliatory tariffs on the other parties vending goods. So, for example, there's often a dispute over subsidies between Boeing and Airbus. Recently, the United States won an appellate body case against Airbus, and we have then taken and followed through by placing tariffs on goods from the European Union. And the hope is that, and the reason that WTO does this is the objective is that, one, either it allows you to take and protect some of your industry to a equivalent amount to the harm, or other industries in the case oftentimes. So to provide, for example, proportional losses to both countries, if you will. But the hope is that in doing that, it will bring both countries to the table to try and resolve their differences and bring the offending party into compliance. Now, these decisions, they have no direct impact on US law, but in certain cases where there have been cases to where the US was found to be out of compliance, Congress has worked with USTR to pass legislation to bring our trade laws into compliance. So it is not something to where the WTO can necessarily force a settlement on the United States or another country, but for the most part, countries do try to take and then work within the system to bring their laws into compliance after they've been found to be out of compliance. But in the absence of doing that, you do have the right to take and place these retaliatory tariffs on goods from the offending country. Now, On a more domestic level, we have our anti-dumping and countervailing duties policies. Anti-dumping can be applied, for example, when goods are being sold at less than fair value. Companies might decide to dump goods in the US market because they have excess capacity, because they're trying to prevent other producers from coming into a market, so they're selling below cost, or because they're trying to increase their market share. But regardless of the reason, if a company is found to be doing this and there is material harm, so for example, let's say that company A is dumping goods into the United States, but the US domestic producers aren't seeing any loss of market share, then there wouldn't be any material harm and there wouldn't be an anti-dumping duty applied. But if there was that harm to domestic producers, there would be a duty put in place to try and protect them from the losses of being undersold by this foreign import. You also have a situation sometimes where foreign producers receive subsidies from their home governments for goods. And in the case where that is taking and causing those companies to have an unfair advantage, we can place countervailing duties on those goods. And the duty would be roughly equivalent to the amount of the subsidy that's determined to reduce the price of the good itself. So these are two domestic tools. There are often challenges on how we, for example, calculate our countervailing duties at the WTO, but these are tools that the US government uses to try and protect domestic industries against unfair competition. As I mentioned, there are a series and they come from different trade laws, and I'll let you know which ones, but provisions in trade laws that give the administration additional powers. So for example, Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974 allows the president to take and limit or place restrictions on imports that cause or threaten serious injury to domestic producers. There were some recent cases that were begun at the end of the Obama administration and that were concluded by the Trump administration that dealt with things, for example, such as solar panels. They dealt with washing machines and things of that nature, so white industrial goods. And tariffs were placed on these goods to take and protect US producers under the Section 201 investigation. We also have Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This was designed to allow the president to impose restrictions on imports if those imports would threaten the US national security. So for example, if imports were going to take, and we often see this in the case of steel, take and undermine the US steel industry to an extent to where the Department of Defense would not be able to take and acquire domestically the types of things that they needed to produce equipment for the military, then the president would be able to take and impose, generally speaking, it's been tariffs on steel imports coming into the United States. We've seen this on multiple occasions. One of the challenges, though, with this is it's only been used a handful of times in the past, but we've seen in recent years what is the potential abuse of this. There was a Section 232 case on automobiles. The results were never actually released, even though they're required by law to be released. The reason being is that, or the reason proposed, because we haven't actually seen the findings, is that the findings actually would not stand up to scrutiny in terms of there being a national security risk from the imports of foreign autos. But what this does is this is a very powerful tool. And if it's not used appropriately, it undermines US credibility abroad, because we want to be able to take and utilize national security restrictions when we face a real national security threat, not just simply when we would like to take and engage in trade negotiations with other countries. And this was something that was used to threaten the EU over their own auto imports into the United States. And so while there might be other tools to address imports from Europe that would have been more appropriate, such as looking into questions of whether those auto imports are coming in underpriced or anything of that nature, the administration could have used. We really need to, I think, be cautious with how we use the national security provisions in our own trade law. There's also Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 this allows the United States to enforce intellectual property rules. This is what USTR used in the recent cases against China. They went through and they documented how, as I mentioned before, China uses its own laws to take and essentially force companies to transfer their intellectual property. When you enter into a joint venture in China, for example, in most countries, if that joint venture were to expire or to be dissolved, the company that originally controlled the intellectual property would be able to keep it. In China, the Chinese company who has acquired it in the joint venture is allowed to keep it. If, for example, there are improvements made to that intellectual property, those go to the Chinese company and not necessarily the US company. And so there are all of these types of things that USTR went through and documented on how China takes and essentially, bends rules or takes and does sort of pressure tactics to, basically force US companies to hand over valuable intellectual property. And so this is what was used where we placed, upwards of $250 billion worth of tariff on Chinese goods to, once again, try to bring China to the table to take and really address systemic reform, within China to address these issues and other concerns of the US government and US businesses in China's own practices. Now, we've only had the phase 1 deal, so it's unclear whether, in the end, this will work. So I think at this point, it's really something where you need to take and have sort of an interim rule. And of course, COVID-19 has disrupted trade, which means that the target set under the initial phase 1 deal will be unlikely to be met. But, this is an important tool for protecting US intellectual property abroad. And intellectual property is an important component of the US economy because it underpins much of the innovation and the different industries that we are leaders in, be it either, internet, telecommunications, high-end manufacturing, these types of things, which are all important for the US industrial and economic base. And then, as I mentioned, we have Section 301 of the US Patriot Act, which allows us to address terrorist financing and money laundering concerns. And this has been used, for example, against both Iran and North Korea, who have engaged in, the funneling of money to try and get around other US sanctions. And so, this is a really powerful tool because much of the world's commerce is done in US dollars, and any dollar transaction has to go through basically a US bank. And so because of that, if you are cut off from the US banking system, which is what Section 311 allows the Treasury Department to do, it can take and essentially cut you off from much of the world's commerce. And so, in the case of North Korea, this may have only had minimal effect because much of what they were doing was already smuggling. There was a major story about how they're still finding ways to use shell companies to, for example, move money through, for example, banks like JP Morgan, banks which you think that they wouldn't be able to do that through. Section 311 doesn't necessarily stop this. That really requires, companies to do a better job of knowing their own customers, looking at these shell companies and going through. But for a country like Iran, which did a relatively decent amount of international trade, which North Korea didn't do, or another country, this has a significant impact on your economy if you're cut off from the US dollar system, because then you have to find alternate ways to take and finance goods, and that raises costs and it makes it more difficult to take and engage in international trade. So, sanctions policy. This is where the United States is really able to take and engage in foreign policy in a way that, at the end of the day, takes and allows us to give leverage to try and shape international events. And what you can see from that is we have certain tools. These tools are, for example, go back to period of the First World War, the Trading with the Enemy Act. This was later amended with the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And then, as I mentioned, we have country-specific sanctions. Now, for example, the Trade with the Enemy Act, in essence, allows the president to take and cut off trade with any country who the United States is at war with. The International Emergency Powers Act essentially was amended this to allow the president to take and declare a national emergency, and then to take and use that emergency to either limit or cut off trade with the country. So these acts have been used, though, The Trade with the Enemy Act was withdrawn eventually from North Korea, but the Emergency International Powers Act has been used to essentially cut off most US trade with North Korea. Now, we have also within, for example, the Bretton Woods Act, other early economic legislation done after the Second World War, different provisions which, for example, limit the ability of the US to take and vote for in international aid agencies, countries who do not have market economies, who are communist in nature, and these types of sanction provisions as well that date back to essentially the Cold War. But in the case of North Korea, we have passed a series of specific sanctions, and these deal with different activities North Korea is engaged in, be they terrorism, human rights violations, cyber attacks. So the North Korea Sanctions Policy Enforcement Act, for example, took and codified into law some sanctions that had been issued through executive order related to North Korea's cyber attacks. And so we've taken and essentially, in the case of North Korea, Congress has moved forward and created a layer of sanctions which deal with all of these issues. And so, this is one of the tools we've used. Now, the challenge or the downside with sanctions is, and I mentioned early on that for sanctions to be effective as a negotiating tool, they also have to be effective in terms of how you remove them. And so what I mean by that is that while we can take and apply significant economic pressure to a country like North Korea, if there is not a viable path for those sanctions to be removed, it removes the incentive for North Korea to potentially comply with what we're asking them to do. Now, I think with a country like North Korea, you have to be realistic. There are certain things related to human rights and other things that are not going to change overnight. But if we want to address the nuclear issue, if we want to address the ballistic missile issue, and perhaps some other issues, there has to be a viable path forward, because sanctions without a viable path forward are not a very useful tool. And so, this is, I think, the challenge when it comes to international sanctions. We have to have a mechanism for removing them that is something that other countries can engage in. And so we really need, probably on sanctions, more work on that. We're very good at finding new ways to apply economic pressure, but we're not very good at finding ways to remove that pressure. And because we have so many sanctions tools, oftentimes if you remove one sanction, the practical effect of that sanction that was removed is still in place because of other sanctions. So this is, I think, a real challenge in sanctions policy and making them more effective. But we also need to be using them more sparingly, because the more you utilize sanctions, like anything, the less effective they start becoming. One, because of diminishing returns, but two, also because, we've seen this, in the case of Iran sanctions. Other countries, even European allies of ours, are looking for ways to get around these because they feel as though they're not being used properly. And so this, I think, is the real challenge, is finding the right balance between sanctioning countries, finding ways to remove them, and maintaining their effectiveness by not undermining their own effectiveness through overuse. So in addition to sanctions, I want to touch on a few continuing challenges for US trade policy. I think there is an increasing debate in the United States on whether we should go for large multilateral free trade agreements or pursue bilateral agreements. And this debate comes from the issue of essentially what is the best negotiating position for the United States. As the world's largest economy, we have much more negotiating leverage in a bilateral negotiation than we do in a multilateral negotiation. But there are also advantages to multilateral agreements, to where, for example, on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I was talking with a Japanese official when it was being negotiated, and I asked them whether they could provide the same types of concessions to the United States in a bilateral agreement that they were proposing to do in a multilateral agreement. And their answer was directly very simple, was no. And the reason they said is that from their own domestic political perspective, they needed to be able to trade off certain things with other countries in Southeast Asia they were going to get in terms of market access there for what they were going to give up to the United States. And so both agreements or both pathways can be useful. The bilateral version can be used to try and implement new trade rules that haven't been done before and show that they work, and then therefore be used to take and move those into the multilateral level. But oftentimes, if you're trying to get larger or greater access to a market, these agreements are political in nature. And so that means being able to take and find the right trade-offs. And sometimes that means, just like we see in sports where you have 3-team trades, you need another country involved or other countries involved to try and find the right combinations of trade-offs to make something politically viable within another country. But I think, this is going to be a challenge for us going forward, is finding the right way to do this. Another issue, which is a continuing challenge for the United States, is how do we maximize trade for US workers? There have been serious concerns about how FTAs have impacted workers' wages, manufacturing jobs. There is a good academic study that demonstrates that around 2 million US manufacturing jobs were lost from China's entry into the WTO. Free trade on the whole with other countries has had nowhere near that type of effect. And so perhaps the China situation is a unique one that has already been dealt with. But as we saw in the renegotiation of NAFTA, which is now the USMCA, there was this whole debate with Mexico about how do you take and ensure that basically you're not sending well-paying US manufacturing jobs to Mexico, and that those workers are then not being compensated. And so this is where you got the minimum wage floor, $15 for, I believe, if I remember correctly, it's 70% of the parts within a vehicle. So whether it's minimum wage floors for certain industries or other things, we need to try and find a way to make sure that while trade benefits the economy, while trade benefits consumers, that it's still benefiting US workers as well. And I think the last continuing challenge I want to touch on is the reform of the WTO appellate body. There have been concerns that the appellate body is beginning to take and reach decisions that are not based in WTO rules, that they are sort of expanding out the body of international trade law, if you will, and that has become a concern. This is something that has concerned the Trump administration, but it also concerned the Obama administration. So there's concerns about this issue on a bipartisan level. It was the Obama administration which first started blocking appointments to the appellate body. So there's going to need to be a way to find some types of reforms that address US concerns, but then also meet the needs of other countries. And I think this is going to be challenging because both the EU and China will have specific interests involved that they'll want to protect. And whether we're able to take and find a way to broach this, will be important. But having an international body that all countries look to and can accept as a legitimate forum for settling their disputes is important for taking and trying to minimize trade disputes between countries. And so I do think this is an important reform that we do need to focus on, even if there are going to be challenges in finding a way forward. The last thing I'd like to talk about is future challenges for the US. And there's a few that I want to touch on briefly. One is digital currency. You may all remember the talk of Facebook creating a Libra, which would have been a global digital currency. There are clear challenges to that based on how Facebook wanted to set that up. But what is more likely is China and Sweden, for example, as well, are taking steps to set up digital central bank currencies. And what this would do is it would allow people to conduct transactions directly with the Chinese central bank. And once you have the ability to conduct transactions directly with the Chinese central bank, transactions wouldn't have to necessarily go through the US financial system. And that would then undermine the US's ability to take and, in essence, enforce US financial sanctions around the globe. It would also make it difficult to take and track, for example, illicit transactions from countries that are violating other sanctions as well. So, I think this is a real challenge for US foreign policy and trade policy going forward. We're also seeing something similar, but to a lesser extent on cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency, contrary to I think what a lot of people believe, is not anonymous. It is pseudo-anonymous, meaning that there are codes that basically track each transaction and who does it or who engaged in that transaction. But at the end of the day, if you know who one of the parties is, you can start figuring out who the others are. And so they're not completely anonymous. But cryptocurrency is used for a high level of illicit transactions. North Korea has used it to try and move money. And it's also becoming more popular than some other currencies. We have seen, for example, recently that Tether, which is a stable coin, which is different from Bitcoin. Stable coins are essentially tied to either a basket of currencies or another currency, so they have a stable value. And that Tether, for example, is now used in more daily transactions than the Thai baht or the Indonesian rupiah. So, there is going to be this movement, whether it ends up being in the private sector with cryptocurrency, or whether it is digital central bank currencies with China and other countries, that will need to be addressed. The Fed is doing studies, and we may at some point move towards our own central bank US dollar currency, but we are not as far along as some other countries in this field. One other issue that will need to be addressed most likely is, while there is controversy in the United States over what steps to take over climate change, this has been a major issue within the European Union for a long time. They were major proponents of the Paris Climate Accords, but one of the proposals in Brussels at the moment as part of their Green New Deal is to take, and in essence, potentially put in place a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the idea behind this is to take, and if they're going to take and raise the standards for what types of emissions are allowed by US steel producers and other heavy polluters, then they want to ensure that basically that's not being undercut by other countries having much lower standards so they can produce goods at a much cheaper price. And so there have been different proposals put forward. One would be to require other countries to buy essentially carbon I'm blanking on the term, apologies. Carbon allowances, similar to what other EU producers are due, or to take and put in place a EU-wide carbon tax. The tax would most likely be the most straightforward and be most likely to be WTO compliant, but we're likely to see some form of this in the future. And I wouldn't be surprised if other countries don't start doing this as well. So it's going to be an issue that's going to need to be addressed either with similar taxes on the US border or some other type of global agreement. Then the last area I want to touch on, which is one that's really kind of come to the fore over the last year or so, which is digital taxes. France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Turkey, and others are moving to create a digital transactions tax. In the case of France, just to give you an example, it would take and tax global companies with revenues of 750 million euros and digital sales in France itself of 25 million euros. Now, the reason France is looking to do this in other countries is that you have a lot of large tech firms who do a large amount of business in countries like France or otherwhere around the world, and they, in essence, do not pay much of any taxes in France. And so this is seen as largely being unjust, and understandably, other governments want things that are purchased in their country to be taxed in their country. Now, in the case of France, this would affect about 30 companies. Most of them are American companies, but there are, for example, a German, a Chinese, and a couple other companies who would be impacted as well. But this is largely seen from the US administration's perspective, and the US tech industry is discriminatory because primarily it impacts US companies. To address this issue, there had been talks at the OECD on global tax reform, which would take and try to, one, set some type of standard for what a digital tax would look like, but would also, for example, European luxury goods are not necessarily taxed always in the United States. And so it would have opened up the option for the US to tax these types of goods as well. So it would have tried to address these areas where there are sort of tax gaps, if you will, in terms of the types of transactions that are going on. But ultimately, I think this is really a dispute over government taxation rights. and there have been, efforts to try and move this forward at a national level. But I think, there's going to be a real challenge if we're unable to find a national agreement on how to take advantage of this, because as we move into more of a digital world, I think it's going to become less tenable for other countries to follow by the idea that they should not be able to allow to tax transactions within their own borders, something which seems like a very innate government right. And so, I think this, though, is going to be a challenge because, while services trade in terms of things like air travel and tourism clearly has dropped off, services trade more generally since the Great Recession has grown at a faster pace internationally than goods trade has. It doesn't account for the same amount of trade as goods trade, but as we see things like autonomous vehicles and other new digital type, not digital, but excuse me, new products to where traditional manufactured goods are being merged with more digital types of services, you're going to see, I think, increasingly the digital side become a much larger part of every country's economy. And as that happens, this is going to be an issue that's going to have to be resolved because it will be a major source of potential tax revenue, which will impact, government's ability to do infrastructure, to provide social services and other things. And so I think going forward, this is going to be an area of dispute and that one that will be increasingly important. And with that, thank you. And I'd be glad to answer some questions.
Troy, what's at stake in the upcoming presidential election for U.S. trade policy? Or, what are the options or what are the different positions of the candidates on these issues?
So I think if we're being practical, I think that there's going to be very little movement on the trade front, regardless of who is elected next. If President Trump is reelected, I would expect, for example, the tariffs on China to stay in place for a while. You're seeing a deterioration in relations over a series of, like tech issues. We've seen, TikTok, which now looks like it may be partially sold to Oracle and Walmart. You have, issues with Hong Kong that have obviously arisen, in recent months. Perhaps, maybe a couple of years into a second Trump term, you might see, a resetting of relations with China. But I think in the near term, that is unlikely. I think in a Trump administration, you'll see a continued movement towards bilateral FTAs. We've started talks with Kenya, for example. So you'll see some things around the margins like that. I think there will be continued, disputes with the WTO, something with USTR Lighthizer, has concerns with. I think, though, if, former Vice President Biden were to win, one, I don't know that trade will be high on his agenda. Two, I think given, and, we should point out that some of the national security concerns, if not all of them with China, are on a bipartisan basis. So I wouldn't see, for example, Vice President Biden taking and quickly moving to try and remove the tariffs on China. I think, maybe once again, after a couple of years, he might move in that direction. It's unclear how much of a bilateral agenda Vice President Biden might have. But even, for example, if he wanted to return to TPP as a way to try and create greater economic cooperation in East Asia, and to try and, build more cooperation against, Chinese practices because of the different political environment and also because of his own needs, I think, to really deal with, one, trying to deal with COVID-19 early on, and two, the economy, which for even the Trump administration would be important issues, that, these types of issues are all probably going to get pushed, into years, 2, 3, or 4.
Could you give us an example of a situation where trade sanctions were effective, that they worked in helping the U.S. achieve its goals or a desired outcome?
So I think the classic case is, South African apartheid, where sanctions worked. But the practical reality is, and, I was going through some of the academic literature on this, and there's a professor I know who this is sort of a specialty, is that at the end of the day, it's roughly around a third of the cases where sanctions are successful, They tend to be successful against governments that are democratic or semi-democratic. And the reason being is because in a democracy or a country that's a partial democracy, you have a large group of different interest groups that a government has to be responsive to where in an authoritarian regime, there tends to be a small group that you have to be responsive to. And so that creates political pressure on, democratic or semi-democratic governments to really try and find an accommodation. But beyond that, they also tend to be more effective when the policy disputes are minor, things to where it's not necessarily in the interest of the government from a national security standpoint to basically try to weather sanctions out, and it's not in its economic interest to continue to take and maintain the sanctions. So I think, this is one of the challenges that we face with, a country like North Korea, in that, they haven't really been involved in international trade in decades. They have shown a willingness to allow their population to live in deprivation, and the elite class has been relatively well taken care of. And so it's really challenging to make sanctions work on a country like North Korea. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't at some point find the right combination, or that Kim Jong-un might face different circumstances which brings him to, or a future leader, to a different conclusion. But this is one of the reasons why I think it's taken so long with a country like North Korea to get the types of results we'd be looking for.
A question from a student. Recently, prominent politicians from both parties became much more protectionist, moving away from a largely free trade economic policy of the 80s and 90s. What do you think is the main reason for more protectionist economic policy proposals from the presidential candidates from both parties?
This is actually a fascinating dynamic. I've looked at polling in the United States on trade. And if you look at polling, going back to like the early 90s, more Americans think that trade is beneficial to the United States than they have at any point in time. You have something only like 18% think it's not in the US interest, if I remember from the Gallup poll I was looking at earlier today. And so you're seeing actually, I think, a real divide between, if you will, politicians in the United States and the American public. And I think that's challenging when the political leaders start going too far extreme for what the public is actually in favor of. And that makes it difficult to keep policy going forward. Now, why would they do that? I think, there's a series of reasons. One, you have certain interest groups who have been better able to take and lobby members to take and pursue their own agendas. You have also a dynamic to where there had been a lot of skepticism on the political level about free trade, especially initially on the Democratic side, but now more on the Republican side, over the benefits of trade, as you saw, factories closing. Now, there are lots of reasons why we've seen, shifts in manufacturing. Trade has played a part in that, as I mentioned, in case of China. But so I think there's really been a narrative, and sometimes from a political standpoint, it's much easier. It's easy as a politician to say, free trade is bad for us. We need to take and, put these policies in place, and to say, well, our manufacturing, has declined in recent years because of A, B, C, and D. So therefore we need to do, H, Y, and something else, that's not, especially, in a time of Twitter where everything is much more succinct, that's really hard. So I think some of it is a messaging issue, to be honest. And I think also some of it is that there have been a series, whether it be in China or to a lesser extent with some other countries, different protectionist policies that we've seen, either in terms of IP theft in China, or the inability to access, for example, say agriculture in the European Union from different regulations there. One of the things I've always found fascinating is that, the EU is 27 countries, a larger population than the United States, and this is even without the United Kingdom, but yet we send half of the amount of agriculture that we send to the European Union to South Korea, to one country. And that kind of shows you the challenge we have. And so I think on a political level, there is a frustration that you know, the U.S. has not been perfect. We have, you know, like the Jones Act, which prohibits, you know, shipping, you know, domestically within the U.S. territorial waters and everything if it's not on a U.S. ship. So like we have not been perfect on this, and I'm not saying that, but I think there has been a frustration with some of these challenges to where the U.S. has largely opened up its market to foreign producers, and in some cases there have been specific instances where, you know, we have been kept out of foreign markets. And so I think, yes, foreign trade is, you know, beneficial to the United States. Yes, you know, I think the American public sees it that way, but I also think on the political level, there's been a frustration with some of these challenges we faced, you know, in other countries.
Don, do you have any questions?
Well, Troy, first of all,
Anything you disagree with me on?
you went through about 250 years of American history on trade and everything, and it was just, I mean, totally fascinating to me. It's Ron, instead of the students buying a $150 book, you could get Troy's slides, you know, and use it. I just want to thank you for a marvelous presentation. I do have a couple of comments. Trade, as you know, is extraordinarily complicated.
Yeah. And I just realized I forgot to mention something that you're somewhat of an expert on, which is like export controls. So maybe you.
That's correct. I was going to talk about export controls, but the United States used to lead the world in manufacturing of machine tools, lathes and milling machines, and call it what you want. And then we adopted this Cold War mentality that if we export these machines, someone's going to make a product on them and use that against us in some kind of a defense posture. So a series of countries were listed that could not import from the U.S. Anything more than a 5-axis machine. And as a result of that, the United States, I think, maybe only has about a 2 or 3%, if that, penetration in the market for sale of our machine tools. And we led the world. And now it's Japan, Korea has some fascinating machine tools, Sweden, Italy, and even China on some of those. So in the U.S. attempt to keep sophisticated machines from going overseas to make products that would best U.S., we lost everything. I mean, it's an entire industry that barely exists today. We do have some Haas, for example, in California and others. Rockford has Coke Industries and some others, but it's just not there. So we lost that, and we look upon how Congress. I mean, this area is so specialized and so difficult to understand that out of 435 members of the House, maybe there were about 10 of us that really understood it and dedicated our lives to working in those very esoteric areas because our constituencies depended upon it, the high manufacturing base, for example, in Rockford. But I can recall a couple of bills. One came to the floor, I think it was called the Far East Something Act. Henry Hyde had introduced it. He bypassed the Foreign Affairs Committee, on which I purposely sat so I could monitor these export controls, came to the floor under what's called a suspension of rules, meaning that's when you name post offices and coins and things of that nature. And I found out about it. The bottom line is that I stopped it. It almost passed the House, and by the time I got to the floor, there were 300 yes votes. So through an amazing legwork on my part and a couple of other members, we reversed that bill. But there was another bill that was coming out of the either the Banking Committee or the Foreign Affairs Committee, I think the latter, and it was sailing through, and I said, just a second. There was another Iran sanctions bill. I said, has anybody done an analysis to see the impact of this bill? And well, and it was cutting in oil and everything. And the bottom line on it is that we had to change the language so that a country could import only up to 5% of its oil from Iran. South Korea, ironically, I had no idea what ever worked for the South Koreans, would have run out of oil had we not been able to do that. But you have to sit down and really think these things through and try to put all these pieces together. So then you have our relationship with China. 1 out of 4 bushels of soybeans produced in the United States goes to China. 1 out of 4. I mean, that's an astounding market. Korea loves U.S. beef, and as a former beef producer for 40 years, I sold the farm. We always enjoyed that. And on the other hand, our rare earth minerals that guide missiles and go into telephones and everything like that come from China. It's such a delicate balancing act in trying to make sure that the security of a country is guaranteed, but at the same time being able to import products so you can make other products.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is, I think, a real challenge, and I'm glad you talked about this. And setting aside the impact on like you said, on U.S. farmers who have seen lost markets in China, I want to move to the Iran example for a second. And you mentioned Iran sanctions, whether someone had done an analysis of how it would impact other countries. I think sometimes we need to have a broader view. There are clear security issues that need to be addressed with Iran in the Middle East. But if we're taking a longer term view, Samsung, about half of all smartphones prior to the recent round of US sanctions were Samsung phones in Iran. They had a significant part of the market for washers and dryers as well. It was a well-respected brand and everything there. At the end of the day, Samsung's bottom line isn't going to be impacted that much by not being able to be in Iran. But because they can no longer operate in Iran because of the current US sanctions, that means maybe not Huawei because of the sanctions we have on the exports of semiconductors and things and other goods to China for Huawei, but there's 3 or 4 other Chinese companies who we don't have those same restrictions on. They're largely going to probably go into this market now, and 5-10 years from now, whenever we settle these issues with Iran, we're going to see an Iran that's not one that's still tied to Europe for a lot of things, and that was buying South Korean electronics products, one of our allies. We're going to find an Iran that's going to have closer ties to China because we've essentially, pushed them, in terms of their consumer goods into that market. So they're going to be utilizing that. 5G is this really important, thing which, it's going to take and change what we're going to be able to do. Autonomous vehicles won't work on like 4G. You have to have 5G to have the bandwidth capacity and everything. You're going to have significant national security implications. This is why the Trump administration has pushed so hard on Huawei. But because of the way things are playing out in Iran, I don't know who would have built the networks necessarily in Iran, but Samsung is one of the few companies that builds these types of networks. Perhaps in a different way, we could have had, a Samsung 5G network built in Iran, and that would have been for our own national security much better in the long run than one that's built, by a non-European or, not by, a South Korean company. And so, we need to balance these things both in terms of how they impact our own industries, like you mentioned on machine tools, and how we maintain our own, edge in, key industries, because, machine tools, as you've told me before, are basically the basis for all manufacturing. But, on these tech types of things, do we really want to push, Samsung out of countries that, maybe we have policy concerns with, but that in the long run, we want to build better relationships with as well? So, we need to be a little bit more deft than maybe we've been.
Troy, let me ask you a question. We have students at Rockford University that have that are obviously in our course, and many will be listening to this program. What advice do you have for students that would like to be in this whole area of international trade? How big is that area? And what do they study? Economics, languages, poetry, so they can go in there and learn without being taught the wrong stuff by some schools. And I say that jokingly, of course, because as you know, what you know, you learned through practice,
Yeah.
And not through school.
So, I think the first question you kind of mentioned that is, it's a wide field. Where do you want to work? Do you want to do policy, meaning working at a think tank, talk about, what are the major issues in trade? What countries should we be negotiating with? What types of negotiations should we have? Do you want to do that type of work? Do you want to work in government? And, we should be clear, you can move back and forth between working in government and then working in think tanks and everything.
And that's preferred to get the experience.
Yeah. I mean, I spent 3 years on Capitol Hill at the beginning of, my career. And this is one of the things I would recommend anyone, whether it be an internship, just do a year or two, because I think you need to sort of understand like how government works from the inside. And the legislature in the United States is only, obviously, 1/3 of our government, because we have the judicial branch and we have the executive branch.
Well, it's obviously the most important.
I would agree with you. And I know some people would say not. And I don't say this because we both work there. I say this because, this is the point to where, really people can have an impact. And I think the thing that a lot of people don't realize is that if you are a young individual, Capitol Hill is maybe where you can have the most impact because, Hill staffs are small, especially like on the House side. It can be hard, as I'm sure you know, on the House because you have to basically be a generalist over like 7 or 8 issues. I was fortunate. I worked in the Senate. I could just focus on foreign affairs and trade. But there are things that you learn and, you also learn things like what is feasible to be done. And I think that's a really important skill to learn. Like what.
And there are internships, for example, with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, the Secretary of State, so many government agents. In fact, nearly every government agency that is involved in trade has internships.
Yeah.
And most of them are unpaid. But it's just the nature of learning. And would you recommend that students who want to get a broad brush of something apply for some of those internships in the summer or whatever?
Yeah, no, I would. And because, I haven't had a chance to work in the executive side of the government, and I'm sure that I would learn a lot about how things work from that end. That would be important for my own, policy thoughts and everything, because, there are going to be unique characteristics of that as well. But, one of the keys, I think, is to sort of understand from a practical sense how things are working. Like, what are the constraints on government? What are the constraints on businesses? What types of things are they actually able to do? And one of the things that I think is great about working in government, but then also the academic side is because, I kind of felt my time in Capitol Hill that I started realizing all the reasons we couldn't do things. And so eventually you start working it down to why we can't actually do anything. And I think, it's good to understand those constraints, but then you need the, side outside of that in the academic world or somewhere else that starts allowing you to think about the possibilities. And so, we often talk about, the professor who has these ideas that are based on reality. I think you need to just move the professor a little bit closer to reality, because it's good to think outside the box and to have those, things as well, because we often face challenges that need new ideas, but those new ideas need to come in the context of what can and can't be achieved, within government. And so I think, that's why it's good to be in government. So that way, when you leave, and whether it's in your own business about things you think could be new markets, whether it's from a policy perspective, or something else, is to know those constraints and then to be able to balance your big idea within those constraints. So that way it becomes a viable idea. And so
Troy, there are internships that are also available in private businesses. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. So you have lobbying shops, whether, you want to go for straight off the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, you want to work for companies, a lot of companies obviously have government relations offices in DC who do international work. They both U.S. companies or they be foreign companies. So, you can do internships with them. There are trade associations. So for example, like there's a trade association for the semiconductor industry. So if you're really interested in tech and you want to know a lot about semiconductors and, what they can do, what new types are coming, what are the constraints, there's the Semiconductor Association. There's the International, well, I can tell you later, sorry, I'm blanking on the name right now, but another like tech related think tank that you can do an internship at. And so you have all these different options. And we should be clear, like just because DC has all these things, that doesn't mean you shouldn't look in Chicago or other places, for internships. But, I think part of it is figuring out, like, do you want to do policy? Do you want to be, the exporter, where you're sending something abroad? So part of it is determining what is it you really hope to do, like, in the international economic field.
Even groups like the National Cattlemen's Association,
Yeah.
which represents the cattle industry, I believe they have interns. And you may study just one area of international trade, but you study one area, then everything comes together. Right, Troy? All the pieces fit together.
I've had very complex international trade discussions with people on the agriculture side because this is really important for them, access to these markets.
Troy, thank you so much. This was really terrific, and I appreciate your time and the time you put into your presentation and the time you spent with us today. I hope you can watch the subsequent talks online and hope to possibly have you speak with classes here again.
Be glad to, and thanks for the opportunity, and congratulations to you both. I've looked at the lineup and you have a great set of speakers for the students over the next weeks ahead.
Thank you, Troy.